I'm Grebby, the Chief Executive of Racism, the Red Card. And with
Hi,
me is...
I'm Shaka Hislop, Honorary President, Racism, the Red Card.
And we're delighted to have Gareth Southgate with us today.
No toleration in the face of racism. Show the red card, pull the red card.
Gareth, thanks for joining us. Just want to ask you, we're 25-year-old next week. Not me and Shaka, obviously, but the campaign. Show Racism, the Red Card. You were signing for Villa, I think, at that time. How much do you think racism in football has changed in those 25 years?
It's a really good question, Jed, because sometimes I think we've made enormous strides, and then at other times I think, have we travelled any distance at all? I think we have, and I think the way that Show Racism, the Red Card have been at the forefront of that has been crucial. I've always loved the fact that not only have you tried to affect things by taking a stand at important moments, but also the desire to educate young people in particular, because in the end, I think that's where we can have the biggest impact. If we educate kids, then what the world looks like tomorrow should be a better place. And I think they're less conditioned in their thinking, and they're more open to education, frankly. So I have always loved that part of the way that the organisation has worked. I think we have come a long way, but I think what's clear in what's happened over the last 6 months, 3 months, week, shows we've still got so far to go. And I feel in our lifetime it will probably be a fight that we're continuing to fight, but we shouldn't get fed up or bored of that. We've got to keep doing it.
And Gareth, you're a Hall of Fame member of Racism, the Red Card. What prompted you to get involved in the campaign in its earliest days?
Well, I think I had always been, from a young player at Crystal Palace, in a dressing room that was a mixture of guys from different heritages. So when I joined Crystal Palace, in the first team, Mark Bright, Ian Wright, Andy Gray, Tony Finnegan, John Solarco. So nearly half the first team were from either African or Caribbean descent. And it just took it for granted, really, that was normal. And then when we started to play in matches where maybe before I got in the first team, the guys would come back and they'd played away from home and they'd suffered abuse during the games, or they'd been received in a way that you thought wasn't acceptable. It was hard to get your head around that, really. So, yeah, when I had the opportunity to be a part of the scheme, I suppose as much as anything, it was trying to stand up for my teammates, but also recognising that when you play in the community that you live and for the supporters that support your team, you've got a voice that might be heard, that might make people start to think differently. And I think we all have a desire to try and leave something for the next generation of players that makes the game better and makes the world better for them.
And you mentioned there playing with Crystal Palace and the role that team plays in its community, as with all club teams in football. But now you're the England manager, and I guess that community is all of England. And how have those early experiences shaped your own philosophies and approaches as the England manager?
Well, I think there's a couple of parts to that. One is I'm better educated, and I continue to learn about this area. So I've not got everything right in my life. I haven't necessarily always got my language right. I haven't always necessarily understood cultural difference. I think there are teammates I played with that I didn't fully understand, and part of that was cultural, and part of that was just their own personalities. I didn't really get the best out of some of the players I played with when I was a captain, for example. So you continue to learn. I learned a huge amount during the summer, when everything happened in America, and I think our level of attention to what was going on in the world was raised. I think there were some incredible podcasts, books, that it was a great opportunity, because there was also some time to take a step back and say, hang on a minute, there are things here I don't know enough about. I'm working all the time with players from different heritages, different backgrounds. I've got to be representing them as well as I possibly can, understanding them as well as I possibly can. Of course, when you're the national manager, because of the role, your voice carries some weight and some power, and it will land in more households than it might have done in a different role. So I think you're definitely, the impact is different. The questions you're asked compared to being a club manager are completely different. We're representing the whole of England, and that's the power for me when we came back from the World Cup in 2018, was that I had people from the Indian, Asian community coming up, Caribbean community, African community, Southeast Asian community, all English, all proud of how the team had played. And that difference was one of the most satisfying things for me, that we did represent everybody. And I think that felt like a bit of a shift, but also that brought tremendous pride.
Can I just take you back to some of your earlier experiences of racing? Because obviously, looking at, can you remember the first time you witnessed it in the game, or either playing as a young lad or in the professional game?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are the obvious examples where maybe we played at a stadium where there was abuse from the terrace, but then what you're more aware of now are the less obvious examples of how people were treated, or language, not direct language, but I guess stereotypical judgments were made of people, or were made of players. And they're the bits I look back on and think, I'm not sure that we were where we thought we might have been 20, 25 years ago. And that for me was one of the biggest impacts of what happened across the summer. This last summer was, in my head, a greater awareness of selection processes, unconscious biases, the fact that, the importance of role models for young people growing up, that they feel that there's a ceiling on what's achievable because they don't have role models in senior positions, they don't have people on decision-making boards. So I think there's various nuances. It's kind of straightforward to think back to games I played in where I think players suffered abuse, but there's a far bigger picture to everything we're talking about. I think when friends speak, they speak differently, and I think one of Shaka's good friends I played with at Aston Villa, Yorkie, so there's a different level of connection when you're teammates, but you would also have a very clear understanding of language that was acceptable and wasn't acceptable, even between friends. But there might be a very small crossover of things where you're giving each other stick in a dressing room environment. That's a very fine line, I think, and I think there's an emotional intelligence needed to know what's acceptable within that. But yeah, I suppose what we're talking about is maybe stereotypes of what might be possible. There used to be comments made about players and what they were capable of, The example being that our chairman at Crystal Palace years ago, I mean, he's no longer with us, so I don't want to be critical, because he was at the forefront of making Crystal Palace a multicultural team, but he made comments years ago about black players being only capable of playing in powerful positions or positions with speed, and I suppose they would be the sorts of things that you look back and now you'd view that as a view that shouldn't be held, isn't accurate, and wasn't helpful in a public environment for how people thought.
And speaking of that, football has been dealing with that issue around language and casual use of language. And this week, football has been confronted with that. Not so long ago, you had the exchange between Bernardo Silva and Mendy at Manchester City. Again, this just two friends interacting, certainly in this case, on social media, and the fallout as a result. Whose responsibility is it in terms of educating around that language? And even when it's between friends, the public use of that language. Who are the ones who are supposed to kind of lead the way and set the example? Whose responsibility is it?
Well, I mean, I'd be interested in your opinion on that dialogue between two friends, and you know, where would you feel that if you had a teammate that responded to you in that way?
Well, I'll say this. We've spoken a lot about our first school visit at Church and the Red Card, me alongside John Beresford. And John tells a wonderful story about his own use of language, racist language, in going to Sheffield United. But he never saw it or perceived it as such. And it's only when playing with the England youth teams and rooming with Darren Beckford that, in speaking to Darren, understood how damaging that language was, and how upsetting it was to so many in the black community. I also understand that in between friends, there can be exchanges that may otherwise cross the line. My issue is, once you have those exchanges, even when it's between two friends who maybe understand that, and understand that nothing is meant by it, and put it out in the public sphere via social media or any other medium that you use, it no longer becomes just a conversation between friends. It becomes a conversation that you are shouting to your 1 million+ followers. And that for me is where the damage occurs, and the owner or the speaker of that language, who put out that tweet or whatever it may be, has to understand the nuances, the implications, and take responsibility for it.
Yeah, I'm in a way reassured, because my view would be that it's that public nature of that discussion that means that other people that are tuning into it don't know the relationship between the two players, and so they're not looking at it in the context of any friendship, any warmth, any and I do think there's a difference between the way certain words might be used, put any sort of sense of racist words to one side. When we're talking as friends and giving each other some stick about, I don't know, how you kept goal, Shaka, or something like that, between friends, that's a very different conversation than between somebody firing in on social media and there's an open forum now, and we're getting stick left, right and centre. So I think what happens between a group of very close people, criticism of performance, for example, is far more tolerated and accepted, because I'm playing with you. I've played with you for years. We've had lots of good times together. We've celebrated together, and now we can handle that bit of criticism. You know, I've missed a tackle. You're giving me stick, but we've got that relationship that's kind of accepted. We're close enough. I think that's very different to somebody from the outside coming in and telling us they weren't impressed with our performance.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure it's the right analogy in terms of racist abuse, because I don't think it's acceptable in any way. But I think as soon as you're in a public forum,
Correct.
the way it's received by the outside and what's then deemed acceptable by people is dangerous territory, because I think it opens up an excuse for people to use language that that we know isn't acceptable.
I totally agree. I absolutely. I think that's a very good parallel. There has to be, you have to recognize the differences and how it affects not just the two people who are the primaries in the conversation, and especially in this social media age.
Gareth, can I ask you about the Bulgaria game, if that's all right? It was clear, or it seemed clear from the outside that you had prepared the players for the possibility of that racism. Is that something that I think you discussed it with the squad and things? Is that something that you managed to talk with, particularly the younger players, about?
Well, we talked with all of the players, and although it would be nice to pat ourselves on the back, the reason why we did that was we weren't really fully prepared when we went to Montenegro the month before. And so during the game in Montenegro, a couple of our players were abused. We didn't really pick it up from the sideline until close to the end of the game. And one of the things that worried me the most was that it felt as if our players weren't comfortable raising that at half time. So things were escalating during the game. How they felt was probably escalating, and we weren't aware of it until on the side 4 or 5 minutes from the end of the game, where we definitely heard abuse of one of our players. So there was a lot of soul searching, a lot of internal inquiry between us following that experience, because the last thing you want is for your players to feel they're not supported, they're not they don't feel that security, that safety, that they're going to be looked after. And also that, how do they want this to play out? What steps do they want to go through? So we did work with the squad before the game in Bulgaria. We were conscious that we could have a problem there. Firstly, we wanted all of our team to know we were with them. Every player, every member of staff. This is a conversation we need to have. We talked about the strength of our group. I think all of the players felt, as is always the case, they just want to get on with the football. But they recognise that actually the message they give and the way that we deal with things is going to be very powerful. We felt it was right to follow the protocol, because if we didn't follow the UEFA protocol, then we could be accused of other things in terms of the context. The players were worried that we might be punished in a sporting sense. In many respects, because we were winning the game, it was an easier situation for us. I always felt that if we were behind and we decided to step off the field or start complaining, the perception of that can look very different. So, but yeah, it was I have to say, not a night I ever want to live through again, in terms of what happened to our players and the way they were treated, but also having to make those decisions on the side. Should we go off? That the ramifications of that are huge. We were already front page story of pretty much every national newspaper because the game was stopped. But I think most important for me was that I think our players felt supported, felt listened to, felt they knew what the plan was. And I'd talked with Chris Powell, who was on our coaching staff, about that before the game, or before we'd even met. So did we get everything right that night? No, I suspect we didn't. was it really realistic to expect any of the players to say, yeah, I'm happy to come off now? Well, I don't know if it is, because we're still putting the players or the coaches in the centre of that decision making, and that's really, having lived through it, that is a really difficult place to be, because there's so many ramifications for it. I don't think we'd be happy to go 3 steps again. You know, I think we followed that protocol, but you did come away thinking, well, hang on a minute, it's almost like people are allowed 3 free shots at us before something happens. The first time that might have been, you know, we might be prepared to go with that. I'm not certain that would be the case again. I think we would be less willing to follow that protocol, and I don't think it would be as impactful. We were the first team to do that, first international team. It wouldn't have any impact if we did it the same way again. So,
So let me just ask, so what can the authorities do better in addressing that issue?
Well, I think, I'm very conscious that we've got to be very careful as a country. We're quick to point the fingers at other European nations, and yet we haven't got our own house in order yet. So I'm a little bit reticent to say we've got to increase the fines on this or throw this team out, because we're not getting everything right in our own country. And frankly, our population is far more diverse than a lot of Eastern Europe, and we should be further ahead. You know, we've had more experience and we've had more time to integrate. So I think we've got to continue that education. I think we've got to continue to constantly raise the awareness. Yeah, so some of the things I have to say, Shaka, I don't know the answers to. I recognise the power that we have in terms of our voice and making sure that people see the way that we work as a team and how united we are on things. The sanctions and things, I really don't know. I've not been able to see how those types of sanctions, the impact of them, and how they might work. But I think we have to keep those things at the forefront of the conversation.
Just talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. You've actually brought it up already. Saw the murder of George Floyd. Can you remember seeing that for the first time in terms of obviously on social media? Can you remember the impact of that on you?
I mean, I think because of the moment we were in across the world, you know, most people's lives were on pause, weren't they? We were, you know, in the main, we were at home. And so wrongly, we've probably witnessed police brutality in the past, and perhaps not reacted quite as strongly across the globe as people have in America. Whereas I think the impact here at this moment in time was both a recognition this can't keep happening, first and foremost, but also secondly, everybody had time to sort of sit and for it to actually sink in more readily. And I think that was, it feels as though that was why it was even more powerful what happened. So it definitely had an incredible impact. And yeah, I think we've only got to look at television as a good example. Media, you know, I often sit in press conferences, get asked about opportunities within football for black people, and I'm in a room full of journalists that's not diverse in any way. Now, when I'm watching television programs, within the space of a few months, that's looking completely different. And that might be a subtle change, but if I'm a young black kid sitting at home, I'm now seeing people like me on television representing my view. And previously, you know, I can't really appreciate what that must have felt like, but I'm thinking about the books that I read my kids. I'm thinking about the illustrations in the books. I'm thinking about all sorts of things that I took for granted as a young white kid growing up because I didn't know any different. And you know, I went through that process with my own kids, and I'm thinking, hang on a minute, players I played with, players I coached, what was that like for them? You know, that's the sort of start point. That's without going to some of our boys and when they were playing youth football and how they were treated by other kids, or walking down the streets, how they were treated. But just the very essence of being a young kid, with every book you read has not got a superhero who's black, or the key character in the story. You know, that's incredible, really, when you take a step back and think about it. I think we've got to acknowledge that across society, let's talk about England, but it applies everywhere. Across society, there are a large number of disaffected groups, and groups who feel unsupported, who feel the future looks bleak. This is only going to become more apparent with the effects of the pandemic, the economic effects of the pandemic. So that tolerance of each other and that understanding that, you know, yeah, there are lots of groups of people here in right across the country, north, south, east, west, that are facing issues of lack of employment, lack of opportunity, lack of education. But that doesn't mean that somebody else's situation should be viewed in a lesser way. And in my mind, the symbolic gesture of taking the knee that the players have taken on, in my head, it's been clear for a while that that's not linked to the political movement of Black Lives Matter. I think that's been made pretty clear. Now, if that hasn't been clear, well, this weekend should absolutely clear that up, because there can be no, misrepresentation of what that is. I think every player that does it is very clear. The protest is against opportunity, is anti-racism. It's supporting our teammates. It's supporting the staff that work with us. It's a unifying. Every time I see it, although I heard people say it's being less impactful, I didn't feel that, because every game I go to, when I see it, I think it is actually hugely powerful. And in a strange way, I was at Liverpool last night. It meant everybody started applauding the situation. So, you know, maybe through what was a situation we didn't like and was uncomfortable to watch and unpleasant to watch, maybe in a way this can move things forward, and I suspect we'll see more crowds clapping the situation and supporting the situation, which would be a good thing. I don't know, Shaka, you'll have a view on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm with you. I think continued taking of the knee is empowering. It's a show of support. I think especially and especially given the work that we do here, SRtRC in the Red Card, it opens up opportunities for conversation, for kids to ask those questions of their parents around the dinner table. You know, why are players taking the knee? What's that about? And for parents to articulate those answers, you know, and give those reasons. I continue to fully support it. I think the danger in it is, and where it morphs into tokenism, is that there's nothing that comes of it. If that players continue to take a knee, but we don't really start to address the lack of diversity in club boardrooms or in other aspects of football. We have to continue to challenge ourselves, challenge the game, in recognizing, you know, the promise of equality. So I'm with you fully.
I think that's a really good and important message as well. we've had discussions within the English Football Association when we talked to some of the coaches like Chris Hughton, Chris Powell, Liam Rossini were on some calls. You know, I made the point that I've sat on a lot of calls and I've been in a lot of meetings where people have talked about change and nothing's happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're all happy to sit on steering groups, to sit on advisory groups, but we're not happy to sit on groups that aren't going to make change, you know, and we've done enough of that over the years. I think everybody's done enough of that. If there's genuine progress and there are going to be measures that we can track that progress and see that there's being a difference made, well, that's different. I think we'd be more supportive.
Guys, I speaking personally, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. It means a lot. I've known you, it feels, through my entire career. We've not played in the same teams together, but we've shared the same spaces. And man, you're a class act. Thank you very much once again.
In the face of hatred, you should pull the red card.